In breaking news, Russian President Vladimir Putin has effectively ordered the invasion of Ukraine.
As a Ukrainian, it was hard watching it from a screen.
Russian forces have pushed deeper into Ukraine.
Not going was not an option.
What seemed unthinkable in the 21st century is now underway.
It was something from a horror film, except worse. It was very much genocide, what they did and what they're doing. I'm Ukrainian. I was born in Lviv, Ukraine. Just before I turned 10, I moved to England with my family. And I moved to Australia. I flew to Poland. There are two different ways you can get across the border. You can drive over, or you can walk across the border. So I walked because I didn't have a car. I was met by my aunt and my uncle on the other side. I walked outside and it was this beautiful day. It was blue skies, it was warm, sunshine. There's a kalina tree in my aunt's front yard. Kalina berries are an emblem for Ukraine. Their red colour represents the century-long bloodshed of Ukrainian people in fighting for our freedom. It didn't feel like I was in a war zone for a little while. It wasn't until later that, it kind of hit me. Every other day, a local man who decided to go to war comes back in a casket. The whole town gathers in the square. They meet the casket on their knees. They line the streets with flowers. And when the procession moves through town, people on the sidewalk literally stop what they're doing. Some of them kneel on their knees. Others just stop to pay their respects. It's really like a collective grief of a town. Once they get buried, their grave gets covered in flowers. People just keep bringing them until the family decides to lay a gravestone. At the start of the Russian invasion, I think there were about 60,000 people coming through the Lviv train station every day to get away from what was happening in their hometowns. People didn't know where they were going, but Lviv was as far west as you could go. Within days, humanitarian tents popped up around the train station, things like Red Cross. They would probably provide what for some people would be their first meal or their first hot meal. There were tents with clothes that people could go and, get a coat or whatever they needed. The volunteers would help them get to their next destination or buy the next train ticket or find a place for them to stay that night or just provide a little bit of mental support. I have really fond memories of that train station. We'd catch the train to Odessa and Crimea to go to the seaside. Seeing it in that state was definitely odd. I think some 250,000 people who were fleeing from the war became settled in Lviv, according to the mayor. Lots of community buildings like schools and camps and theatres actually became homes to those people. On the outskirts of Zhovkva, there's a summer camp that my sister and I used to go to. My auntie took me there because she said it was used as a shelter for refugees, lots of women and children. It was just bizarre, I guess, going back to that place. The school in Kyiv, I think it's about 15 kilometers out of Lviv, and there were several dozen people living there. And I found this little boy all by himself. He told me he came from Kyiv. It's a town about 50 kilometers out of Kyiv, and it had been occupied by Russians for a couple of weeks before it was liberated. I asked him what it was like, and he had this iPad and he just nonchalantly looked up and told me, oh, they're bombing us. I went to Kyiv several days after the Russians had retreated from the area and the occupied towns around the capital had been liberated. I was filming around Irpin, and there was a guy with a wheelbarrow that was dropping off rubble. He was one of dozens of people that started cleaning up the town, and I got talking to him.
Ну и больше полтонны зарядов мы в ящиках собирали. Делал фотографии мин, у меня в телефоне, кстати, есть, которые не разорвались и передавались с этим. Обходили полностью все участки. Долгое время добивались, чтобы убрали тела. У нас на улице было 14 тел.
Irpin residents that fled the town were not yet allowed to return, as the army was still clearing landmines and other explosives left by the Russians. Dima showed me where he lived and the makeshift kitchen they made outside their flat because there was no power, water or gas.
Это я подарок от солдат. Я показывал лёжки, где были снайпера, где были военные, и мне разрешили взять с одного места газовый баллон.
He told me this incredible story about how he got the Russians drunk and tricked them into showing him where their base was.
И я подошел, они стояли на этом месте, один капитан был. Я им говорю, вы домой вообще хотите вернуться? Они такие, да, типа хотим, ну побыстрее все бы это закончилось. Я говорю, давайте по 50.
Listening to the story, and I'm thinking, this is classic Ukrainians.
Участвовал, ну, скажем так, по-одесски. Они выпили раз по 50, закусили яблочком. А я еще когда налил, он такой смотрит, ого, мы так много не пьем. Постояли минут 10, покурили, я налил еще по 50, прошло еще минут 10, он уже начал меня обнимать, все, они уже расслабились. Вот. Я говорю, ну, я не хочу вас выгонять. Давайте уже по третьей, как в любой хате хорошей, по третьей. Мы выпили по третьей, они совсем расслабились, ну и под этим состоянием я говорю, слушай, у вас есть какие-то сигареты? И они меня приглашают прямо к себе, прямо туда вовнутрь. Насчитал 9 человек, пересчитал, какое оружие, то, что я видел вокруг себя. Принес сигареты, мне дали 9 пачек собрания. И потом 6 километров на лоток, там где наши, ставил координаты, где находятся русские.
And eventually getting that base blown up. It was brave, it was brazen. It involved vodka, obviously.
Вот здесь была одна пулеметная вышка, и вот на том месте вторая, где сейчас ребята сидят, там у них окопанка была. Ручной пулемет стоял вот здесь. Вот на этом месте сидел пулеметчик, который смотрел в ту сторону. Кстати, вот этого парня подругу убили. А он живет возле нашего дома. Она вышла поздно вечером, ее расстреляли прямо возле дома, возле калитки.
When I walked through to the courtyard of this building, the first thing I saw was this purple tulip that had sprouted in among all this rubble, and it was, I guess, a little symbol for hope.
Мене звати Володимир, я голова ОСББ цього будинку. Приблизно 3-ї години снаряд влучив там в газовий розподільчий шкаф. Ну і з тої сторони загорілося повністю пінопласт весь, дах.
Добре.
Так, дивіться обережно, згорів. З 1-го по 5-й поверх включно всі згоріли.
A lot of People from Irpin were evacuated, but there were a lot that stayed. One of those people was a priest and his wife. They actually ended up hiding and sheltering, I think it was about 40 people in the basement of this tiny church in the middle of a park. And it was freezing. It was a tiny little basement, and it was just hard to imagine that at one point there were 40 people there. But he saved them. Ukraine is a predominantly Catholic country. Faith has had a huge role to play in the strength of Ukrainian people. About 5 kilometers from Irpin is Bucha. The bridge in between those towns was blown up by the Ukrainian army to stop the Russian advances through to Kyiv. People fleeing through the river, through the rubble, just in desperation to get out. A large convoy of Russian tanks and armoured vehicles was ambushed by the Ukrainian army and blown up on the street in Bucha. There was about a kilometre worth of debris and large chunks of metal on this road that ended up blocking further advances and stopping the 40-kilometre long convoy of Russians that were heading for Kyiv. But it also meant that a lot of angry Russians were now stuck in this small town, that were stuck in Bucha, and they took it out on the locals. And what happened in the month that followed is now known as the Bucha massacre.
Дуже багато лежали без них. Вони позабирали їх. Це наші, мабуть, 3 числа позабирали. Мой зятя забрали, ці всіх позабирали. А один хотів через дорогу перейти на Кірова, там до сусіда чи що, теж пальнули все. Дуже багато постріляли людей, дуже багато. Невинних людей.
Сейчас нам говорят, что это обманный обман.
Боже упаси, я стара людина буду обманувати. Ви що? Он якби ви там скільки лежало їх. Боже, матінко рідна. А там он доколо на Кірова поховані люди у дворах, на городах. Дуже багато поховані.
Ви не хотіли виїжджати, чи просто можливості не було?
Ми вже пізно, вже все. Я на роботі робила, у больниці я роблю. І якраз вже все, почали бомбити, я ледве додому дійшла. Але мене не тронули, бо їхали багато їх оцих же танок і хлопці. Але вони кажуть, хлопці, не трогайте мене, почала плакати. Ну вони кажуть, проходьте, я пройшла.
She was telling the soldiers how she was so happy to see the Ukrainian army rolling in. She cried, she said she was, praying day and night for them. And yeah, one of them actually cracked. He walked away. I think he had to walk away because I think he was just about to burst out in tears himself. And it was actually that woman's birthday that day. What a way to spend your birthday.
Та вона ще оцими днями плакала, тут під очима понапухало, що я вже не знаю. День і ніч плачуть за сином. Ну, застрелили його 4 марта. Він йшов на вулиці зразу коло десь минут 20 до хати. Його забрали в мішок, а куди забрали, ми не знаємо.
Some people were buried in their front yards, the spot where they were killed, just shot dead. It was something from a horror film, except worse.
Людина несла хлопцям воду, там хлопці сиділи, так? Людина просто воду несла. І русські освободителі, як вони говорили, просто розстріляли. Хлопці прийшли, хотіли допомогти, він каже, йому вже не поможеш, перезарядив і добив.
І ще 4 дні не давали забирати труп.
І 4 дні він пролежав, не давали забрати труп, похоронити.
Собаки давай вже за руки його.
Голову погризли трохи собаки, ну його заховали і все нормально.
Ну не давали забрати навіть.
4 дня він
По-людськи,
пролежав.
щоб по-людськи заховати.
Діточок убили теж.
Жінка дзвонила, десь пішла на стадіон біля школи, на зв'язок хотіла вийти. Набрала телефон, вона піднімає трубку і її застрелили.
А як ховали, ну ми брали палку, на палку чіпляли простинь і держали, щоб не подумали, що ми щось там можемо на їх, щоб заховати цих людей.
The bodies that were found on the streets were put into a mass grave at the back of a local church. More than 400 bodies of men, women and children were found in Bucha. 117 of those were dug out from this mass grave. There were people discovered in torture chambers, in basements, bodies found of, men, women and children. People with their hands tied, people who had been shot from the back of the head, people whose teeth had been pulled out, limbs had been cut off.
Оце ж дівчат молодих шукали, або гвалтувати, або я не знаю, що, питалися. І ходили по хатам провіряти зброю, і камуфляж. Бо знаходили камуфляж, чи ж там якусь зброю, розстрелювали.
One thing that people didn't want to talk about on camera was the rape and the torture of women that happened in Bucha. I didn't speak to any victims or survivors directly, but I spoke to people that knew them. There was a basement in Bucha where 25 young women and girls were held and were repeatedly raped and tortured every day, several times a day. Apparently some of those women died from their injuries, from the brutality of the sexual assault. The Russians said that they wanted to rape women to the point that they either died or they would never want to have children again. And many of them did die. They found, naked bodies of women with torture signs, and it's not something that people have talked about, and it's not something that was shown much in the news, but for me that justification, why they wanted to do it, why they did it, was another piece of evidence that, it was very much genocide, what they did and what they're doing. When we were leaving Bucha, we drove past what looked like a regular scrapyard, but we went back in and saw that it wasn't. It was another collection of war crimes that were shredded by shrapnel, riddled with bullets, incinerated. There were cars that had white pieces of paper with the word child or children stuck behind a screen, a windscreen that was smashed and shot up with bullets. There were white pieces of cloth tied to the wing mirrors. There were effectively these steel coffins that contained only traces of the people that were in them. And there was this one car in particular, it was a tiny little hatchback. I was told a woman was fleeing with her cat inside it. She was driving away from Bucha, and she had her head blown off. It's nauseating. I probably didn't see half or even a fragment of the horrific things that were left behind in Bucha, but I saw enough. Around 40 kilometers northwest of Kyiv, The trail of destruction continued. We went to Borodyanka. In the centre, there are about 5 apartment buildings just completely destroyed. Offices, schools, absolutely obliterated. And there's a square in the middle of the city facing this apartment building that has a large hole right through the middle of it. And facing it is a monument of a really prominent Ukrainian poet, Taras Shevchenko. The monument has bullet holes going through the head. It's a really powerful visual representation of what's happening. It's this attack on not only Ukraine, but I guess its culture, its arts, and its history. The firefighters in Borodyanka were just working 24/7 since the town had been liberated to clear the rubble. The locals told me that when the apartment buildings were bombed, they would hear people that were trapped under the rubble screaming and asking for help for days, but anyone that came out and tried to help them would get shot by the Russians in town. Perched next to a crater of one of these apartment buildings was a woman called Lyudmila. And she said she was waiting for the firefighters to finish clearing through the rubble because her sister and her nephew were living in that building and had been trapped under it when it was bombed. І ви не знаєте, чи там була ваша сестра?
Їх не можна впізнати взагалі нікого. На жаль, тут була дуже велика пожежа, 4 доби. Тут горів, вигорав газ. Ми не знали, що то таке, думали, що то ракета догорає. За 10 хвилин до ракетного удару племінника бачили. Він біг у під'їзд.
Скільки йому років?
24 роки. Хороший хлопчик, закінчив університет, велика перспектива в житті, спортсмен.
Weeks after we left, the State Emergency Services of Ukraine announced that they finished going through the rubble and they ended up finding 41 bodies buried underneath.
Щирі, хороші люди. Пахарі, які просто працюють на хліб, собі самі заробляли. Нікому нічого поганого не робили. У нас були свої гаразди, свої негаразди, але це наші гаразди і негаразди, наша країна. Ніхто не мав права робити те, що зараз вчинили. Це жорстоко і несправедливо взагалі. І за це, звичайно, будуть відповідати.
At one point when I went back to Lviv, my dad asked me to meet up with his old friend. He was an artist, to pick up some paintings from him. Igor was our old neighbour. He lived in the flat below us with his family. I still remember the smell of his workshop and the oil and acrylic paint. In 2014, Igor went to war and became a frontline sniper.
Після 2014 року світ для мене змінився. Автомата ніколи не тримав і бажаю нікому не тримати. Жити цивільним життям, але в нас нема виходу і треба брати. Я свої 40 років зустрів якраз, скажімо так, на передовій лінії. Ну, я зрозумів, що то не закінчиться швидко.
He didn't tell his family, he didn't want them to worry, and he travelled a lot doing art shows, so they thought that's what he was doing. Eventually they found out, and when he came back, he found himself homeless with severe PTSD.
Війна – то такий клубок, там, де можна побачити зразу все моментально. То, що тут за ціле життя не побачиш.
He picked himself up the only way he knew how, and that was by picking up his paintbrush. Now he's selling all the paintings that he has done since then of Kyiv and Lviv, and he's selling them to raise funds for the army and go back to the front line.
Але зараз я дуже пишаюсь за нашу армію, за наших людей, за всіх. Всі разом, і навіть які тут вже давно не живуть, дехто приїжджає, дехто допомагає за кордоном, але всі разом згадали, що ми є українці. От. І це мене дуже тішить і дає велику надію на нашу перемогу.
Another one of my dad's friends turned his home in this tiny little town on the outskirts of Ivano-Frankivsk into a vet rehab center. And when Putin announced invasion of Ukraine in February, they just went back to their front lines to serve again. And that home became a military aid hub and a place for displaced people from over east.
Так що я є колекціонер, я збираю прапори, і дуже є багато різних прапорів, які з 14, з 15, 16 року. І, на жаль, не всі, які підписалися на тих прапорах, зараз в даний момент вже живі. Але все одно це є історія, це наша Україна, і не шкода за неї і умерти, і в будь-який час піти до кінця.
Everyone had sort of a role to play. Women would pack boxes full of supplies, things like food, medicine, and they would load all these supplies to the brim into cars of other civilians and volunteers, usually men, who would then risk their lives and transport all these supplies to the front lines, to the hotspots. And there was the granddad and a grandma of this household. The granddad would make little seat pads for soldiers out of gym mats, and the grandma would cook for everyone.
Хлопці воюють, ми допомагаємо з тилу, і постійно всі в русі, як бджілки.
О, і сюди ще яка. Що зараз в цей час, от ми як великий вулик бджіл, які розлетілися по всій Україні. І ми несемо в нашу країну, бо ми її захищаємо. Все. Кожна людина встала і робить те, що вона зможе зробити. От. Зараз все йде на те, щоб ми захистили свою державу. Все.
Ну тут і без війни дорога, звісно.
Her husband, Vitalik, he served in Donbass for 3 years. He was going to Zaporizhia the next day, and I asked if I could get a lift with him. On the way, we stopped off at Vitalik's friends, and in fact it was his friend's parents' house. We just turned up at their front step without question. They fed us, literally gave me their bed to sleep in, and the next day loaded us up with more food and coffee. That was a really heartwarming thing. Throughout my whole time in Ukraine, I never had a plan, an itinerary of where I was going to go. I didn't have a driver. I would sort of go off to one place, not knowing where I was going to stay that night, who I would meet. I would get picked up from a train station in a city I've never gone to before by a stranger. I would stay at their house, or I would stay at their neighbour's house or their friend's house. Zaporizhia is a major Ukrainian city. It's only about 200 kilometers north of the Russian-occupied Mariupol. It was the spot where the people that had somehow managed to escape from Mariupol would go to. That would be their first stop. А як тебе звати?
Семен.
А скільки тобі рочків?
10, в этом году будет 11.
Розкажеш мені, звідки ви приїхали?
Mariupol.
A little section of a department store north of the city was turned into this processing center. The car park in front of the store was just filled with cars and buses, the vehicles that the refugees would come in on, and vehicles that would then take them to the next destination. And inside the center, there was a little section where people could go and grab some clothes if they needed. There was a little kitchen where they could get a hot meal or a drink, a little medical center, and most of these people were mothers, women and children. И там страшно?
Очень. Мы там были, сидели, пили воду из-под батареи, ели сырую картошку. Потом у нас была открыта дверь, потом волонтер, дядя Сережа, кричит: люди, люди. Мы услышали, потом он пришел, все его окружили, и он нас вывез. И люди не хотели идти пешком, потому что боялись, а он сказал, что там несколько километров и уже не стреляют больше.
This little boy's mum, Alina, her face and the way she told her story were seared into my brain.
То, что там страшно, нечего есть. То, что когда твой ребенок на тебя смотрит и просит хоть что-то съесть, а у тебя ничего нет, и туда выйти ты боишься, потому что там лежит труп, который готовил для тебя суп, и он не успел добежать.
She got out of Mariupol with her 4-year-old daughter and her 10-year-old son.
Знаю, черные, когда воды нет даже помыть просто. Когда, извините, я в одних трусах с дома сбежала, и в этих одних трусах я месяц там была. Фу. Так у меня дети взрослые, а там у нас дети маленькие. Они тоже с труб эту воду цедили, как-то пытались, фильтровали через ватку, штукатулку. Все дети рыгали от этой воды, пить никто ничего не мог нормально. За суп дрались.
There was this 96-year-old blind great-grandmother, and she said even though she couldn't see what was happening around her, the things that she heard would give her nightmares.
Дети кричали невыносимо. Это я в кино такое только видела. Страшно. Кричит. Вышел муж возле подъезда, то ли кушать разогревать на костре. Почему ведь ноги оторвало? Кричали, они скорой не вызвать. Ни телефона, никакой связи. Ничего. Друг его кричит: Петя, потерпи, смотри на меня, все будет хорошо. Но умер. А через стенку слышу крики, мать кричит: спасите его. Русланчик говорит: я мама твоя, посмотри на меня. А вот вокруг, а в ответ в общем ничего. Мурашки по телу.
I think probably half of the people there were kids. It's really sad to think about what those kids would have been through.
Пережили мы, конечно, сказать слово ужас. Нет, это не то. Это страшно. Мы с сыном из Мариуполя прорывались вдоль набережной завода. Заметил нас самолет и стал бомбить. Мы под деревья стали прятаться. Потом дошли до центральных ворот, и он попал как раз перед нами. Мы чудом живы остались.
Зустрічають, бачать.
Galina was one of the people behind this whole operation, and she herself was from Mariupol.
У мене забит месенджер, у мене 1000 адресних. Врятуйте, допоможіть. За ці 2 тижні стільки є. Там, де діти бачили, як їх батьки загинули, де у дружини чоловік на очах загинув, де діти загинули. Мені розповідають, як не можуть поховати. Сиділи, їх обстрілювали, потім вийшли, а собаки розгризли тіло на частини.
А що вона пише? People in Mariupol were getting messages saying things like, Ukrainian fascists were circling in on you, your time will soon be up. The man who showed them to me got out with his parents. The journey normally takes around 4 hours, but it took them around 4 days.
4 дня.
Seeing them shaking from fear of what they'd been through, the state of the car that they got out in, it broke my heart. Of course, a lot of people that had fled weren't so lucky to escape uninjured. I went to a press conference at a local children's hospital. The hospital director told us that 2 critically injured boys from Mariupol were brought into the hospital overnight. Afterwards, we walked down to the surgery waiting room to find 2 mums. They were essentially waiting to find out if their children were going to live.
В Запорожье попали мы 21 числа. Когда мы сюда ехали, попали под обстрел.
Marina's 13-year-old son was one of the 2 critically injured children undergoing surgery. He was wounded from shell shrapnel and the doctors were trying to save his legs.
Это вот что с вашим домом?
Нет.
On the other side of those doors, the surgeons had wheeled out the other boy. He was less than 3 years old and suffered severe internal injuries. A missile hit a bomb shelter on which his family was sheltering in.
Завалило всех. Мужа ударила этой крышкой. Муж тоже ребра переломаны, позвоночник, контузия легкого. По внутренним органам тоже сейчас в больнице. Ну и вот травма малыша. Сегодня 8-й день, как это случилось. Много раненых. А вы ж видите, что никто никому не помогает. Мы все эти дни, кстати, сидели и ждали, когда нам помогут. Когда на левой приедет эвакуационная машина, нас эвакуируют. Мы так молились, надеялись, ждали. Но с каждым днем все хуже и хуже.
Eventually, Anastasia was able to see her little boy. There was this tiny little body, pale and skinny. His mum said that he had just been asking her for food because he hadn't eaten for 10 days. I caught an evacuation train back to Lviv from Zaporozhye. There was a young woman that got on the train, and the first thing she did was get her pen out and write her name and her details on their arms and on pieces of paper that she then put in their pockets because she was so terrified of losing them. I was told that many injured children from over east were eventually transported to the Lviv Children's Hospital, and it was actually where my mum had worked when we still lived in Lviv. I remember it really well because I spent a lot of time there after school waiting for my mum to finish work before we could go home. And one of the doctors I met there had actually remembered her and he gave me a little tour of the hospital.
У нас сьогодні знаходиться 3 важких хворих з евакуйованих міст, з Маріуполя і діти з Херсонської області.
In one room there were 2 boys, 7-year-old Sasha and 12-year-old Ivan, who were brothers. And they were fleeing from Kherson with their granddad and their mum. They actually had no idea, but their granddad had died trying to save them, and the doctors didn't think that their mum was going to make it either, and their father was back home on the front lines. Another one of the children was a 13-year-old boy who came from Mariupol. His name was also Ivan. German paramedics were getting him ready to transport him to Munich, where he would get further treatment. He had the most horrific leg wounds, and they had to hook him up to a machine to make sure that he'd be okay in the journey back into Germany. It wasn't until the German paramedics were wheeling him out of the ICU that I recognised his mum, and it was Marina, one of the two mums that I met at the Zaporizhia waiting room in the kids' hospitals. It was one of those incredible moments. I think what medical staff in hospitals and cities under attack, what they're going through is almost another front line. It's really remarkable. I travelled with a group of volunteers that were delivering some food and supplies to one of the hospitals in Kyiv. And I interviewed a couple of surgeons there that lived at the hospital for the last 42 days. They hadn't left. They'd been working non-stop. At one point, at the start of the invasion, they were actually bombed during surgery. І ви тут чуєте, як ви можете на людині оперувати під час такого стресу?
Так, трошки страшно, конечно. Ну, там уже який там метод, ми вже старались як можна швидше закінчити операцію і перейти десь там і в бомбосховище.
Що було саме гірше, що ви бачили?
Ну, це страх, відчай у людей, крики оці про допомогу. От, і привезли одночасно там десь до 15 хворих. От, ну, слава Богу, як ви бачили, там у сховищі у нас було багато і людей, і чоловіків. Всі допомагали, всі гуртом.
Не тільки співробітники.
Да, всі гуртом носили, всі допомагали. Так що велика подяка. Що змогли зробити, те зробили, так сказати. Кого не спасли, ну що ж, не спасли.
My train journey to Kharkiv was a bit of an interesting one. The train station in the city of Kramatorsk had just been targeted by a Russian missile, so tensions were quite high. They turned off all the lights, the platforms were pitch black, the train itself was pitch black, and you had a conductor that would walk through and say, don't make any phone calls or send any messages to say where you were going. In the morning, I walked down the train and actually found 3 guys, a Brit, an Aussie and an American.
My name's James, I've come from the UK. I'm over Ukraine at the moment because I'd seen on the news what was actually going on over here. The second day of the invasion, I applied to my embassy to join the International Legion. Unfortunately, the International Legion refused my application when I got here due to lack of combat skills. So we've done a bit of a travel out to the eastern parts now, hopefully find some legion or some unit what might let us join. Yeah, I've got my family back in Middlesbrough in the United Kingdom. I've got a son as well. They all know they didn't agree with me coming, but they understand my thoughts on the situation and they understand why I'm here.
I found out that these 3 guys actually had nowhere to go, no one there to meet them. And so I told them that there was this guy meeting me. I'm sure he'd help them out. We met Mad Max, that's how he called himself, and if you know him, you know why. We went back to his house. He showed the guys his stash of weapons that he hoarded from the Russians.
And you have big
And then we had beer for breakfast. And he told us what was happening in his city over the last month.
Slava Ukraine.
Every morning, people in Kharkiv would wake up to smoke billowing from somewhere along the city's skyline. Cluster bombs and shells rained on Ukraine's second largest city every day that I was there. The firefighters in Kyiv were working around the clock. Every day there was at least 1 or 2 buildings that were on fire, and they just went out to their job praying that it wasn't a residential building, that they wouldn't have to pull someone out. Below ground, people were still hiding and living in their basements. I spoke to some people. Their apartment building was bombed and, there was no windows and doors. Ти там спиш?
Да.
Тут холодно?
Да.
These are the people that decided to stay. They say because they had nowhere to go, or because they were just adamant that, victory was so close.
Я думаю, все буде добре. А це моя внучка і це моїх 2 внука.
Хочете виїхати?
Ні, ми нікуди не поїдемо. Ми будемо тут. Ми надіємося, що победа буде за нами і пускай йдуть, откуда прийшли, і сюди ніколи не приходять російські військові.
Ви не бачили ще, не приходили сюди?
Ні, ми не бачили і бачити їх не хочемо.
Маєте тут зброю?
Немає. Якби ж була, у нас є лопата. Топорик є кухонний, так що ми їх теж будемо чекати.
Hearing this woman saying how they were waiting for Russians with frying pans and shovels, it conveys the character of Ukrainians, that brazen spirit. Out of all this horror and tragedy and grief, I guess what has stayed with me and resonated with me is this resilience and resistance to what was happening. The grit of people just fighting till the end, giving it their all, bearing through the worst grief imaginable. It's come at a huge price, but I think now the world has sort of seen Ukraine for what it is. I think we've earned the respect of people around the world, of leaders around the world.
Slava Ukraine.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine has done the very opposite thing of what he's intended. He's actually made Ukraine a stronger country. I wish I was still there. I'd hate to see the world lose interest or forget about what's happening over there. There's not a shred of doubt in my mind that we will come out of this better than ever, stronger than ever, and that we'll win.